Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is our series where every week during the legislative session, every other week outside of the legislative session, we bring to you our center directors for an update on important state policy, key areas of state policy and changes in the legislature, action on legislative issues and bills, and basically keep you updated on everything that you need to know about your state, how it could impact your life, the way you work, the way you raise your children, and the amount of money that comes out of your pocket to pay for it all. So with that, it's a special holiday edition. This is Valentine's Day. And Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director and overall budget guru, has noted that Olympia has a special Valentine's Day message for you today, primarily dealing with a lot of people complain about how expensive gifts are and flowers are. Everything's going to be really cheap tomorrow, by the way. If you could celebrate Valentine's Day on the 15th, you're good to go. But you probably won't get the same romantic gratitude as you might otherwise if you ignore today. But it is going to be it's potentially an expensive holiday. We've got some hearings today, and Jason's going to update us on that. Jason, you noted that there's 4 hearings. All of them have to do with raising your taxes here on Valentine's Day. Let's walk through them.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Happy Valentine's Day. And the legislature loves our tax dollars. Doesn't so much love tax relief, but definitely loves our tax dollars. So it is Valentine's Day, and there were several hearings this morning on 4 tax increase proposals. Some constitutional problems, some competitiveness problems, and I guess the biggest frustration is we're seeing a lot of tax increase proposals, but yet we remain the only state in the country, as far as I can tell, that over the past 3 years has not provided any type of broad-based tax relief. So apparently tax policy in the state of Washington is a one-way relationship, and that is to infinity on beyond on tax increases. But the bills that we had up today, first of all, is the wealth tax. So a couple of challenges with the wealth tax. First of all, as it is structured, it's unconstitutional, right? Because wealth is property, and even the sponsors acknowledge it's property. And as we've talked about a lot with income taxes and with the capital gains income tax, there are some restrictions on how property can be taxed. 1% in uniform. So this particular wealth tax, it checks the 1% box, but then it starts to veer into that unconstitutional part of the equation by having a $250 million exemption. That's not
$250,000, right?
No, $250 million.
$250 million exemption.
They are trying to go after just the rich of the rich.
See, I was thinking in terms of what next year will be, because it starts with the $250 million and then it works its way down.
Yeah, so I mean, there's your first strike on this proposal. It's unconstitutional. The second strike is the fact that these taxes are easily avoided, right? It's a privilege tax. Do you want to pay a tax just for the privilege of residing someplace? Wealth taxes don't exist anywhere in the United States for a reason, despite the efforts of Senator Warren and Senator Sanders at the federal level. And those places that they have existed in Europe, the trend has been not to expand them, but to repeal them. And in fact, the French, the incoming president in 2017, repealed their wealth tax because he said that when we had this in place, we lost our tax base because all of these individuals decided, I'm just going to go move someplace else and not have to pay this. And that's the situation you find here in Washington State is if you do this, you have 49 other states where you're not going to pay this privilege tax. And then you lose not only the potential revenue, but all the other activity that individual was providing in the state of Washington. And usually these are entrepreneurs and employers. And this is exactly why this huge effort that we've gone through the past few years of this bipartisan tax structure working group took a look at this. And the recommendation and the advice from that process was don't do this because it's too easy to avoid it.
So on the wealth tax, how would that work exactly? I mean, how would they collect, or how would they decide how much you should be taxed after the $250 million exemption? Let's say I'm a billionaire, for example.
Yeah, so again, if you go back to our definition of property, it's everything subject to ownership, whether tangible or intangible. And right now, Washington has decided as a policy to not necessarily tax intangible property, right? Those are going to be your non-liquid assets. And the reason for that is it's hard to tax because it's hard to evaluate at any point in time what the value of those are. So what the concept of this wealth tax proposal is it doesn't matter if it's real property, if it's intangible property. Once a year, they're going to try to evaluate the value of that, and then you would owe that 1% tax on it outside of that 250 million. Interestingly enough, the one of the advocates for the capital gains income tax is the University of Washington professor Hugh Spitzer, who's been itching for decades to try to get an income tax in the state of Washington. Even he came out and said, yeah, this is unconstitutional and would be really hard to administer.
He's also the one that was so shocked by Washington Policy Center's advertising campaign, quoted extensively in the Seattle Times as being upset. Not upset by capital step demonstrations or appeals to the media, just upset by us. Surely a non-biased source.
Or maybe the fact that he helped write the bill.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there was your first tax on the table today, was the wealth tax.
That's number one, love letter from Olympia. Number two.
But they love you so much that we have 3 more love letters to go. So the second one might actually sound pretty good, right? If you look at the bill, and there's a constitutional amendment and there's a statutory implementation, it's a property tax rebate for homeowners and for renters. That sounds great.
You got me so far, right?
Right. And the reason why you have to have a constitutional amendment, we just talked about it, is because property has to be taxed uniformly. So you can't tax residential and commercial differently. So what the concept of this, and we've heard this in other bills, and in fact, there's a Senate Republican proposal that would do what's called a homestead exemption, where it takes your first $250,000 of value of your home and it would exempt that from the property tax. That's kind of a clean way to do this. Where this one starts to go sideways, and I'm going to call it a Trojan horse for an income tax, is they don't just do the property tax rebate, they also repeal the uniformity clause in the Constitution. So what happens if you repeal that? Well, you don't have to guess, because the sponsor of this in the Senate, Senator Frame, actually said, well, yeah, if you repeal this, that means we can do a graduated income tax. But don't worry, nobody's proposing a graduated income tax.
No. That reminds me of several years ago when Senator Phil Fortunato had a constitutional amendment proposed to ban income taxes. And I was watching the debate from the sides. And anyway, speaker after speaker, this is a total waste of time. Nobody's talking about an income tax. And finally, I think it was Senator Hasegawa stood up and said, well, I do like an income tax. And there was this groan, but also a lot of the people there were exactly as you uncovered with these emails, they were thinking directly of income taxes at that time with the capital gains income tax efforts underway. So it always makes me laugh when they say, oh, we just want it this way, but don't worry, we'd never pull that trigger.
Yes, I mean, not only does repealing the uniformity open the door to the income tax and obviously the wealth tax, but it creates the split roll possibility where you could tax residential and commercial differently. And you can also discriminate amongst residential property. And in fact, again, Senator Frame testified, this was not a flaw, this was the goal, because there are some lawmakers, in her words, that want to disincentivize certain uses of property, like using your home as a rental or an Airbnb, to where you could tax those differently, to where you really start to discriminate on the uses of property in your tax code. So that was one of the love letters being heard this morning, is getting rid of the uniformity clause and open the doors to all sorts of property tax increases that we haven't even considered yet.
Now, doesn't that cause a problem, though, with the 2 subject rule? Or does that not count in a constitutional amendment proposed?
So again, you can do property tax relief without repealing the uniformity clause. Right. It's not necessarily a single subject. This is just their back way to try to do this. Again, let's say somehow this is not going to pass the legislature because the Republicans are seeing through what this proposal is. But if somehow this went to the ballot, what voters are going to be saying is, do you want a property tax rebate? Oh, yeah, I want a property tax rebate. But buried in there is that repeal of the uniformity clause.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it made it to the ballot, would it, I mean, I assume if Tim Eyman were running it, let me put it that way. If Tim Eyman were running it, would it be an unconstitutional proposal? Because as you point out, you can do the one thing without doing the other. The other is a separate subject.
I mean, this is bad policy, but it wouldn't run into the single subject because there is a nexus between.
Okay.
Once you get rid of that uniformity, you can do even more discrimination about your rebates you have. So they can make a nexus on that.
So it's even more dangerous, really, because it has a much bigger implication than the first. Hey, it's like I forget the name of those fish, those deep water fish, but they have that little light that hangs out, and they just look like monsters of the deep, with those big fangs. And the little light just attracts people in, and then it's too late by the time they figure out what the light is. Same thing here. You're dangling this little property tax relief here. Hey, look at this. And then suddenly you're stuck with statewide income tax.
Well, you like that fish. I prefer the piranha because, once we get in the water, they just want to eat us alive.
They smell the blood. They're after you. All right.
So again,
number three,
that's love letter number 2. Love letter number 3 is, we on, I believe, several occasions have passed that requirement that we want to have the 1% growth factor on property tax increases, right? It's called that 1% limit. So there is a bill that was heard this morning in the Senate that would increase the local property tax increase factor from 1% to 3%. So this is a pretty straightforward tax increase, no games, no hidden motives, but that was another love letter that was on the agenda today, is to say we want local property taxes to increase faster than 1% to 3%. And the final love letter.
Well, hold on. Would that solve anything, though? Because one of the complaints of local government is always, hey, the state mandates things, we're stuck implementing them, and we don't have the money to implement them. The state doesn't provide the money, which is, at times anyway, it can be a fair complaint. But, one thing I've noted is if, giving someone more money doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do they're going to take care of priority number 1, 2, and 3 with it. Because they can always just spend it on what they want, then come back and say, what, these priorities still can't be paid for because we don't have the money, and demand ever more. So was there any kind of any specificity as to why they would want this tax or what they would spend it on?
Well, have revenue will spend, right? That's why the Association of Washington Cities and local government officials testified today in favor of this, because they want the flexibility to be able to collect more to spend. Now, you can argue whether or not 1% or 3% is the proper growth factor and how much flexibility local officials should have to capture that revenue to spend. But the bottom line is it is an increase in tax collections.
Yeah. Well, and a quick reminder to everybody, if you have questions for Jason at any time, just place those questions in the Q&A box there on your screen, the little function at the bottom of the screen for Zoom. For some of you, it might be on the side, but it's hard to miss. And we'll try and get to those questions as soon as they come in. So we're down to the last love letter, number 4. The love of money is pretty strong today. What's the next potential tax increase that has a hearing today?
Yeah, so the final love letter from Washington is that they love us to death and they just want to tax us for dying, right? So this is the death tax. Now, there are 2 different proposals before the legislature concerning the death tax, and one of them we actually testified on in favor last week. So let me start there, because we're one of only 12 states in the country that makes death a taxable incident. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the estate tax. But the triggers, somebody dies and you're at an income threshold. That's why it's called the death tax. So already we're in a minority of states. We're the only state that, even though we're going to have an asterisk with the capital gains income tax, we're the only state without a broad-based income tax that imposes this type of tax. So you have another check against your competitiveness as far as locations where people with high estates might want to reside. But what's even worse is when they imposed this death tax, it had an inflation calculator, right, for the exclusion, because you don't want to capture more estates than you're supposed to, right? There's supposed to be taxing the wealthy. But the inflation calculator that the bill pointed to was a certain federal report that has not been published since 2018, which means there's no operable inflation index for our death tax. So that exclusion has not increased since 2018. And think about,
has inflation increased since 2018?
Well, think about also how high property values are in the Puget Sound.
Yeah.
So there are a lot more people that are becoming subject to this than was originally intended. And in fact, when you look at the collections going back to 2014, more than 75% of those that paid the death tax were for estates less than $5 million. That's only going to grow without this inflation index. So the good bill is House Bill 1484, and it would do 2 things. It would restore an operable inflation index so that you have this exclusion amount that grows over time. But it also rebase those brackets as if that had actually been in existence since 2018, since it was through no fault of anybody but the federal government for stopping a certain report. That bill, even though it was heard, has not yet been scheduled for executive session, so I don't know if they're going to move it. The other proposal that was heard today, it also has an inflation fix, but it decides that We love Washington's Tonians dying so much that we want to add even more brackets. And in fact, right now, our death tax, we're tied with Hawaii for the highest top rate at 20%. That's not good enough for Washington State. We need to be number one. So this new bill would increase that top rate from 20% to 40%. That was the bill that was being heard today.
Wow. That well, that reminds me of the wealth tax then. I mean, when you have punitive things like that, people with large estates, unless they are dying to give a big contribution to the government, to the state of Washington, I mean, even people who might be on the left that want to give away their money ahead of time, or on the right, usually they want to choose where, which charity gets that money and which causes that they believe in. So I expect that we would see an exodus of primary residency for a certain category of resident.
This does remind me of an example of, I think it was New Jersey. It was about a decade ago, so forgive me if my memory is wrong, but I remember reading the revenue forecast for, I believe it was New Jersey, and they had a little asterisk in there where they assumed a certain individual would die, and they were going to bank on that money in their budget.
Wow. So it's like the pre-writing the obituaries for newspapers, and every once in a while, one of them will kick out and the person's not dead yet. And they're like, hold on, save that for when I die. Yeah, that's, I assume, if for some wonderful reason I ended up that wealthy, I would, if I saw that, I would move out on purpose, and I'd make sure in my last will, if I ever lose my faculties or anything, make sure I move out of this state just to be ornery.
Well, and this goes back again to the problem with the wealth tax, is that what you're talking about actually happens, right? If you don't go, if you're not able to go through the estate planning to minimize your tax burden, people do relocate. And then what happens again is you lose all that other activity that was being taxed.
Right. So you're not only losing the death tax, but everything that they were spending money on. In some cases, their businesses, but in all cases, maybe their sales tax money, maybe their B&O money, whatever it happened to be. So big problems there. Now, that covers the Valentine's Day love of money portion that we had for Olympia. And we closed it off with till death do you part with your money from Olympia. But what about emergency powers? Jason, this was an issue you followed very closely. We had a really great, I thought, animated video kind of explaining the problem for people. This was, made manifest, I think, by a nearly 3-year state of emergency, quote unquote, that was held by the governor in light of the COVID pandemic, and then there was a reduced legislative authority during that period of time. So one would think that regardless of party, legislators and houses, each chamber of the legislature has historically tended to be zealous of their own authority, wanting to make sure that their own authority, separate from the legislative or the executive or judicial branch, is maintained. But we haven't seen that this time with emergency powers or with what happened with the extended nearly 3-year emergency under COVID. So where are emergency powers? Where is emergency powers reform at now?
Yeah, so I mean, we just talked about how much the legislature loves your tax dollars. Apparently, there is no love for checks and balances and oversight of emergency powers, because we are going to be going out on our belief.
Correction, they like checks, just not checks and balances.
Well, I think they prefer the automatic electronic payments. That's what they want for the
There you go.
Yeah, so I believe we're going on our third session now, where these bills to just put basically the same type of oversight that exists in the rest of the country, because too often this becomes a personality thing about whether or not you like what Governor Inslee did or don't like it. But it is a statutory imbalance in our current emergency powers, because we don't provide that same type of oversight that exists in most of the rest of the country, to where there has to be at some point a check-in. And the bills that have been proposed, again, bipartisan in the Senate, there were bills again in the House, no public hearings, not even a public hearing. We have held public hearings on declaring the state name the Evergreen State, on the dinosaur. And we just had one this morning on universal health care, asking Congress for universal health care. And those are the things we're holding public hearings on. We have not found time or the will to hold public hearings on the emergency powers bills, and cutoff is on Friday, the 17th. So these bills will not be moving yet again. And all that we're really asking to have happen is to provide the same type of oversight that exists when the governor waives a law. Because you may have heard the governor say, I don't know what the problem is. The legislature's approved dozens of my proclamations. Well, that's true, because when you waive a law, that expires after 30 days, unless the legislature approves it. The flip side of the coin, though, is if you issue a restrictive order on citizens or on businesses, that requires no legislative oversight and can continue indefinitely. And that's why we had 975 straight days of these, because there was no check on those. There's no logical reason to treat those two actions by the governor differently. Both of them should have the same amount of oversight from the legislature, and both should expire. And it doesn't matter whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. It just can't be indefinite, unlimited power for one person behind closed doors in the executive branch to make policy, when policy is the role of the legislative branch.
Yeah, this is the one issue that really, it actually does surprise me, because I thought, incorrectly as it turns out, that the legislative leadership, regardless of party, would be upset by the extended lack of authority, and that they would want to modify that because they have a constitutional job to do, and their traditional authority has been thrown out the window here on this. But so it's surprising to see this kind of maybe it's a reflection of our partisan times, but it's surprising to see this kind of rally around the executive branch and total defense there, and refusal to take a look at the separation of powers, when all there's one party that controls the both chambers and the executive branch. There doesn't have to be any partisan implication to this issue. You can still propose all the same things. The legislature could still approve all those things, but it would go through the public process, and I'm using the word ironically now, the democratically elected people that are there to represent the people. The people would be represented in these policies, but no movement at all. It's one of those rare times when I'm genuinely surprised.
And I join you in that surprise, because it is uniquely a Washington phenomenon. Right. Yeah. This has not been a partisan thing across the country, because let's take a couple of examples. Obviously, Washington is a Democratic trifecta state. Governor, House, Senate, all controlled by the same party with pretty good margins, right? Well, there are three other states that fall into that camp: Hawaii, New York, and New Mexico. And even though in those three states, their emergency powers actually had more legislative oversight than Washington's, you saw the Democratic lawmakers in those three states put their foot down and say, we appreciate what you're trying to do, Governor, but we are the legislative branch of government, and we have a role in this process. And they tried to fight back and put even more oversight into their existing statutes than they currently have. I'd be happy for what those states have. We don't even have those here. Yet in those three states, you saw the Democratic legislature say, we're the legislative branch of government. I do not understand why this is just strictly a Washington phenomenon, where our legislature's like, here's the keys to the car, Governor, have fun.
Maybe they just felt like they weren't getting paid enough. I know that the salary commission just said they're all going to get a raise. Maybe this will inspire them, and they'll say, you know what, it's time to earn that check. We really should reassert our authority.
Dave, since you brought up the pay raises, let me just do a very quick segue. So the Salary Commission did come out recently and recommended pay raises for all statewide elected officials, legislature, judicial, executive. Whether or not that was the proper recommendation, whether or not it was too much, too little, the problem is that's the end of it. There are no changes. Once this commission, which was adopted by a constitutional amendment to remove this from the legislative process, the normal appropriation process, once they decide whatever they decide, that's the end of the story. The same thing happens with the state employee contracts, right? The governor negotiates solely with them, and whatever he decides, the legislature can't change. That cannot be the way these decisions are made. Appropriations decisions should be part of the legislative process. The legislature should be accountable for any of those decisions that are made. So whether it's the state employee salaries or it's their own salaries, we need to restore this back to the legislative budget process and not hand the keys over to people where you can't make any changes.
Now, I can see why the legislature would not want that authority on this one, because a pay raise is one of those things that's never popular with constituents, or rarely so anyway. And so having it go to this third party and just being able to say, you know what, I didn't want it, but it's there. That's one of those things where you can see the political advantage of not having the authority.
Now, maybe instead you'd have a conversation of, well, we're giving ourselves a pay raise. We're going to join the rest of the country and give you a tax cut. Right. That conversation.
That would be nice. And I mean, we haven't had one since 1982. So maybe it would be maybe now would be a good time. The 80s are back in vogue, back in cultural fashion. So maybe it's time to repeat that particular milestone. Jason, appreciate all your time today and your work. That was a great Valentine's Day blog. I got a good chuckle out of that. We put together a couple of Valentine's Day cards that we shared on social media. So those of you watching, if you want to take a look at those and share them, that'd be much appreciated, of course. And my colleague Donald Kimball wrote a nice little "Roses Are Red" poem for that, so that would be fun as well. Also, I'll remind you that this episode will be uploaded to our Washington Policy Center YouTube channel within 24 hours or so. So if you missed it, or you know somebody who missed it and wanted to catch up, they can watch it there. And I'd encourage you to check out our blog daily. There's a lot of things happening in Olympia right now, and our center directors are updating on Olympia on a daily basis. So if you miss a day, make sure you get to washingtonpolicy.org and check out the latest there. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, we'll hope to talk with you about our affordable housing recommendations. We have a new publication on affordable housing that will be released in 2 days. So watch for that at washingtonpolicy.org. Some of the costs that are added will shock you. If you're not familiar with that issue, added by government rules, regulations, and policies. And so when you hear talk about why isn't housing more affordable, and you read this, you realize we're adding an awful lot to the cost of a house and causing a lot of the problem that then the same people who created that problem then want to solve. So we need to get out of our own way when it comes to affordable housing. You'll see that coming up on Thursday at washingtonpolicy.org. It's a new publication from Mark Harmsworth, and hope you'll share that and spread that amongst your friends as well when you see that on Thursday. In the meantime, thanks so much for joining us here on Washington Policy on the Go. We'll see you next Tuesday.